Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 106. My guest in this episode is Jason Delgandio, and Jason is an assistant professor of rhetoric and public advocacy in Temple's Department of Strategic Communication. And in this conversation, we discuss one of his publications that covers a matter that has held sway over him for the last 30 years and has made up a part of his academic development. And it's talking about the vibe, whether we're talking casually and colloquially about the vibe, or we, as in this conversation, are talking about the phenomenology, the epistemology, and a little dabbling in metaphysics about what we might mean when we talk about the vibe. So if that intrigues you, please join us for this conversation as an observer of the conversation. And I thank you so much for your time here. And I'd like to welcome Jason Delgandio to the IdeaCast interview series. Jason, welcome. Good to have you here.
Hello, Justin. Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you being here as a guest. I was just saying before we hit record, I read one article from the literature or a piece from, I was struggling to figure out an essay, thesis from the literature, and was motivated by it. I'm excited to talk about it, share it with the audience. And speaking of that, welcome to the YouTube audience. I will say to you, those of you who are subscribed to my channel and came here from people doing Phil of Mine and cog science psychology, that you'll enjoy this conversation and what Jason has to say. Excuse me, before we get started into the meat and potatoes of or the soy and the and the collard greens, or however you want to sort that out, into the bulk of what we want to talk about, let's get a little background on you and get the audience familiar with where you're coming from.
Sure. So, hello to the audience. Everyone's watching on YouTube. My name is Jason Delgandio. I'm a college professor at Temple University in Philadelphia. At Temple University, my expertise is in the theory and practice of social justice, with a focus on activism and social movements. So I essentially study how human beings create social change. However, outside of Temple, another expertise of mine is the vibe, or vibes in the plural. I know it may sound strange to some people, but I've actually been studying the vibe for approximately 30 years. Going back to my late teens, early 20s, I was involved with various subcultures, microcultures, countercultures, etc. Early rave scene, jam bands like Fish, things like that, underground house parties, etc. And in these subcultures, everyone tend to use the word vibe, right? So as a way to describe the DJ, the music, the band, the party, the overall collective experience, etc. And at some point, I realized, though, despite the fact that we're all using this word, very few people are trying to define it or explain it. So I took an intellectual interest in this experience of the vibe very early on. So again, late teens. Then I wrote my first paper on the vibe in a college class on nonverbal communication. Then I went on to use my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation to develop a philosophy of the vibe that I call bodily emanation. And that was, I guess, in 2002, I earned my PhD. Flash forward now to 2024. My latest project is called the 20-Minute Vibe. And it's really me offering up my knowledge about the vibe and manageable chunks of information. So a 3-minute essay, a 5-minute video, an hour-long self-paced video lecture, etc. And it's really created for those who are intellectually curious. So I don't consider myself to be a new age guru or a healer or anything like that. But instead, I'm an academic, I'm a scholar, I'm an intellectual, and I approach the vibe as a site of intellectual investigation. Right. And I take it upon myself to help other people understand the vibe and to articulate their experience of the vibe. So how might you turn a feeling into an idea? And in doing that, it gives you more awareness about the vibe, about your experience, more control over it, how to use it, how to project it, etc. And so that's the very quick intro about my background and how I came to explore and investigate the vibe.
And in our starting to open up into the substance of what you just laid out, I would maybe order the beginning of our conversation with a semantic revisiting of what you just said, and then we'll move into the phenomenology, and that might be orbited by epistemological evaluation or however we want to sort that. But I do want to go in because I think it was good that you qualified this by saying that this is not necessarily relating to some of the connotations or context of vibe that might be batted about in circles on the internet or where books, whatever publications, this is a good faith treatment of what is a vibe, especially in agency, in the phenomenology of human experience. So let's look at the semantics for a moment, and just sort that out just a little bit more about what you mean by
Sure.
vibe.
Right. So my most basic definition of the vibe nowadays is the exchange of energy between you and other people. So again, the exchange of energy between you and other people. Now, to give some examples here of what I'm talking about. So for instance, you're at a musical concert and it's you and hundreds or thousands of people, and you feel the vibe of the band, you feel the vibe of the audience, etc. Or at a sporting event, and there might be 60, 70, 80,000 people, and whatever sport you might imagine, so baseball, football, hockey, whatever it is, and you're all cheering for your team, and you can feel the electricity in the crowd. Right? Or think of a first date, right? And one of the ways we evaluate a first date is whether or not there's a connection between myself and the other person, right? You might say, wow, there's a really good vibe last night on my first date, or it's a really bad vibe, whatever the case may be. Or another example, let's say a heated argument between you and family members, or you and your friends, right? All of a sudden, there's a certain kind of tension there. It's very intense, and you can feel that tension literally between you and the other people. Or likewise, let's say you're at a work meeting. What is the overall mood or atmosphere at that work meeting? Right? Or even like going much larger than this, think of a different town or a different city. So the vibe of New York City, the vibe of Miami, the vibe of Chicago, the vibe of San Francisco or Portland, right? Each place has its own feeling. Right? So going back to what I said earlier, the vibe is the exchange of energy between you and other people. All right. Now, from there, the question becomes, what is the nature of this energy? And that's really the grand question, right? Is this energy material or immaterial? Is it scientific or spiritual? Is it physical or metaphysical? Or perhaps all of these things all at once, depending upon how we want to define it and kind of chart out our understanding of it. So very briefly, that's kind of how I understand the vibe.
Okay. And then perhaps before we get to phenomenology, just I can't help but think of sort of metaphysical grounding to this as well. And you talk, and we will get into some of the language you use, and emanation or eminence is used. And so it got me to thinking about, there's subtle body cues, and there are different ways of framing this. But I wonder, and you mentioned this in the article, and to the audience, I will have links down below to the piece that Jason had written that you can explore for yourself, and we're kind of unpacking it here. But just it got me to thinking sort of about metaphysical processes that are going on, or physiological processes that are going on. And you touched on electromagnetism and things like that, and I think that's gaining traction in a certain discipline within biology. I had Mike Levin on. He's a biologist, and he talks about sort of the bioelectric communication between cells. And so when I looked at your work, I was almost affording myself a sort of scale invariant perspective, where if we have these physical cells within these body systems, within this Markov blanket of a body, they're communicating again through peptides and electro neurochemistry or whatever it is. But we can abstract that out from the physical body, and it may have to be an abstraction, but I almost wonder if there isn't, and this isn't, again, invoking New Age subtle body, what do they call it, auras or anything like that. It's more that there is this continuum of this sort of subtle communication. So am I just blowing gas here, or do you think maybe there's some credence to that if we could launch an inquiry from a metaphysical perspective?
Sure, I'm open to all of that in the sense that, as you just said, there are different kinds of energies and different kinds of vibes or vibrations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of how our cells communicate with each other, et cetera, biomagnetism, bioelectricity, et cetera, from there, right? Then the question for me, though, really becomes, how many different kinds of energies are there, right? And as we as human beings, which of those energies are we consciously aware of? Right? So just to back up here for a second, the word vibe is used all the time in our society, right? So I invite your listeners over the next week to just pay attention to the word vibe and how often do they use it, or how often they hear people on television use it, in music, in songs, in casual conversation, etc. And so that's like a leading clue. Like, all right, if we're all referring to this thing we call the vibe, but then like, what do we mean by it, right? So in some New Age traditions, just as an example, they will argue like, well, from the perspective of quantum physics, right? All the atoms are vibrating all the time. They vibrate at different frequencies, and they form molecules, and the molecules vibrate, and they create the physical world, etc. Right? And so, as far as I know, that is true to quantum physics, right? But I'm not sure, though, that we as human beings are consciously aware of that whole process, right? But yet, there's some kind of level of experiential knowledge happening here. Like we feel certain things, we walk through and we feel something, a mood of a crowd, atmosphere of a room, all those things. And so I'm trying to parse out what that means.
Mm-hmm.
One way to do that is what you were saying earlier, right? Looking at certain disciplines and starting from that perspective, like very like these are physical energies that can actually be measured, right? Having said that, though, I'm not sure if that's the totality of this thing that we call the vibe, right? And it's like this liminal space, like which is it? Is it physical, metaphysical, right? Scientific, spiritual, And so, and I try not to posit one paradigm because once you posit a paradigm, then you cut off all the other perspectives, right? So it could be this, it could be that, it could be something else, etc. Hope that all
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can't exclude the totality or the synthesis of sense data in all of this,
Right.
right? So that we're sort of niching out this very subtle, perhaps energetic, but there, again, as I mentioned, physiological cues, subtle cues, because when I always love to invoke the idea or pull out the idea that information theorists say that, like 10 million bits of data are bombarding our sense organs at every second, and that we only have access to about 120 or 40 to 100. So I mean that leaves a lot of room for what is below the radar, so to
Right.
speak, in self-awareness or metacognitive or whatever's going on there. And you'd speak to this in your article. But yeah, so that leaves a rich field of inquiry there for that. And so yeah, I just wanted to catch that real quick
Sure,
before
yeah,
we go into phenomenology, which let us segue in. And I
yeah.
believe, in your article you start with Husserl and affection, and so let's start there, and we'll build up to your thesis and to where you arrive.
All right. So one of the places I begin to try to theorize and understand this thing we call the vibe is through affectivity. We say affectivity, in other words, how do bodies affect other bodies? How do bodies influence other bodies? As you're just saying, Justin, much of that process, much of that affectivity is subconscious, where it's below the threshold of conscious awareness, which, if you think about this, makes sense. It's very Freudian, very psychoanalytical, or very phenomenological, right? So you have your body that's inserted into a physical environment, right? You have your conscious mind, and your conscious mind is really wherever you form your attention, like wherever you look at or attend to, that's what you're consciously aware of. But most of our experience is subconscious or below that threshold, right? And so our bodies and our environments are directly intersecting with each other and mutually influencing each other. It's a basic phenomenological insight that the body and the environment are really a exist in like symbiotic relationship, right? So that's affectivity. So our bodies influence each other below the conscious threshold, right? Then other theorists, though, such as Eugene Gendlin, who's a lesser known figure, um, really focused on the notion of sentience, right? And he
Mhm.
argues that our bodies are sentient creatures, sentient organisms, and this sentience, in other words, this feeling organism, this whole operation, this whole process actually precedes and exceeds perception, right? And not just conscious perception, but the five physical senses, that we are a feeling creature first, a sentient creature first, and then a perceptual creature only afterwards. Then from there, it's like, well, if we're sentient creatures and we inherently feel our environment, is there another kind of feeling that is conjoined with this sentience? And that's when I talk about bodily emanation, right? And I argue that our bodies emanate or radiate a tangible feeling that is felt and experienced by other bodies, right? And that's when I say, well, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we say the vibe, right? That the vibe is a form of bodily emanation, and each body emanates a vibe out into the atmosphere, into the world. And then we respond to those vibes either in a subtle fashion or in terms of the work that I do, trying to make it more of a conscious experience.
Mhm. Mhm. I have a strange mind. I'm thinking, the four E's of Cogsci. You could almost append a fifth E, the emanated, because you have embedded, embodied, extended, and enacted, and then, maybe the eminent, or
That's awesome. I have not thought about that. It's really good, actually. Wow.
Yeah, and it's all relational too. Everyone, and for me, I love extended mind. I'd love to abuse that to no end, but this is kind of an extended mind scenario where, again, both physiological and perhaps metaphysical cue. Well, metaphysical in the sense, again, going back to that abstract notion of what might be being distributed, whatever the carrier of that might be. But then again, more things that we have access to, apprehendable physiological cues, are part of that extended mind, I think. You know, and I'm not going with the Chalmers definition of extended mind where you write down on a tablet or you have a computer or something. This is more, to me, is an extension into through substance back to the cognitive agent again. So anyway, I might be on a weird tangent, but I think about these things, and so like I said, thinking about 4E, it really it maps well with what you've been talking about, and going now to your theory of emanation, you parsed it, I believe, into two forms or modes of that emanation, and there's sort of, as we've been discussing, there's sort of conscious and maybe pre-conscious. So do you want to expand on that a little, articulate a little more on that? Okay.
So for your listeners and for your viewers, I guess one way to begin this conversation is to think about standard psychoanalysis, right? Or therapy, if you don't want to do psychoanalytical theory, but like therapy in terms of you have your conscious mind and you have your subconscious mind. Your conscious mind is the things that you're consciously aware of, and your subconscious mind is all things that you're in your environment or in your body from your previous experience that's influencing your conscious mind, right? The same thing can be true for our experience of vibes, right? So if I am going on a job interview, I'm trying to consciously project a certain kind of vibe, a certain kind of energy in the room to try to get this job offer, right? Or if I'm speaking in public and at a podium, right, and I'm trying to emanate a certain kind of vibe out into the world. Or if I'm a band on a stage, or if I'm the star athlete on a team or a coach of a team, right? I'm trying to command people's respect. We talk about charisma or magnetism, right? Those are all kind of a conscious form of bodily emanation. But as we were saying earlier, though, with affectivity and phenomenology, a lot of this is subconscious, right? So at what level does the vibe operate, at a subconscious level or a pre-reflective level? In other words, at a level that we're not quite yet reflective about, right? And then from there, how might that pre-reflective or subconscious vibe influence our lives? The way we move, the way we feel, what we think about, who we meet or who we don't meet, right? So one of the things that I argue within my philosophy of the vibe, bodily emanation, is that there's a certain kind of gravitational force to the vibe and bodily emanation, right? It has a pushing and pulling effect. And this is true really for all phenomenology, right? If you investigate the big names of phenomenology, that's what they mean by affectivity, like this pre-reflective realm of affection that moves the body in certain ways before we're consciously aware of that. Now, you argue that the vibe has a similar process. Again, conscious vibes, but then subconscious vibes or pre-reflective vibes, right? And so one way to think about this, though, is that it's not just about this vibe or that vibe or a good vibe or a bad vibe, but rather our bodies are constantly emanating a vibe nonstop all the time, without trying to do this, which is to say that our bodies are vibing on each other all the time, right? And so it's kind of this collective phenomenon that is happening, right? That's what I mean by the pre-reflective realm of bodily emanation.
When you mentioned gravity, I thought back to the reference that you had put in to your thesis into the article that I read, and you spoke to being at a concert and being drawn away from what should be the obvious in your salience mapping, but to someone who was over, 50 yards away dancing that shouldn't really stand out to you. So again, I thought about this kind of again, salience landscaping and being moved over to something that is relevant to you in that instance. Can you unpack gravity just a little bit more in that sense? Because again, I'm taking gravity to be figurative or a heuristic almost, to say, that my salience mapping, my attention, my predictive processing, whatever's going on, is being drawn unconsciously to that amazing dancer, the attractive person, whoever they are. And I don't mean attractive, a lusty kind of way, but just your being that's attracting itself to you. So can you open gravity up just a tiny bit more for me, or just say that I'm being too figurative? And
no. Well, It depends on how you want to look at it, right? And so this word of gravity or a gravitational force.
Okay.
Um, I can honestly say I'm not sure if I mean that literally
Hmm.
or metaphorically, right?
Okay.
But it's the idea that the vibe within how the vibe operates, there's a certain attraction and detraction, right? So based on the energy and vibe that I'm giving off, my bodily emanation, right? That's going to harmonize or repel with another bodily emanation,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
But of course, that can get very detailed and very complicated very quickly, right? Perhaps I'm not constantly thinking like I would be attracted to this person, but I am for some reason. And
Hmm.
it could be for romantic purposes, sexual purposes, platonic purposes. And there could be a million different reasons, right?
Hmm.
The idea that we are attracted to and detracted from certain people, certain experiences, certain events, etc. And again, I use the concert experience only because I've been to a lot of concerts. I love live music, right?
Yeah.
But I think we all have this experience, whether it's at a concert, again, a sporting event, at the grocery store, at the bank,
Hmm.
whatever it is, right? We are pushed and pulled in certain directions and ways that precede our conscious mind, right? Um, Again, in traditional phenomenology, this is a process of affectivity, right? Body and environment. In my work, though, it's an issue of bodily emanation. So the question is, again, the vibe is not just, in my terms, a throwaway term that we use for everything. Like a vibe on this, vibe on that, but rather it's a part of the human condition, human experience, right? And it operates at different levels of experience. And I think what you're getting at though is like, well, how does this pre-reflective attraction actually work, right? Um, well, I mean, I offer up ideas and theories. I can't give you a concrete mapping of it, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I always point to people's experience. So I would ask your listeners and viewers, right? Um, Again, over the next week, let's say, be conscious of how your body moves through the world, right? Be conscious, be aware of your body, be aware of your surroundings, right? And then try to be aware of how you are pre-reflectively or pre-consciously or subconsciously moving through the world. Why did you choose this aisle over that aisle? Why did you choose to talk to this person but not that person? Why did you choose to sit in this seat and not that seat? Right? And then ask yourself, like, well, what is happening here? Right? Is it a certain kind of feeling and energy that I'm being attracted to or repelled from in another kind of way? Right? And then bring those pre-reflective subconscious experiences into your conscious awareness. Right? And that's what I mean by being reflective about the vibe and bodily emanation and energy, mood, and atmosphere, all those kinds of things.
Yeah. And I think gravity is a great word. I mean, we have terms, phrases like the gravity of the situation,
Oh, right, yeah.
and it really, it just, again, you convergently focus on something, if, be it good or bad or otherwise. But that, yeah, that's a draw, a lure that's bringing you in. So, whether there's any physiology behind
Yeah.
or physics behind it, that doesn't matter. I think,
But
beauty of our language is that it's metaphor.
it's instructive though, right? And so
Yeah,
again,
yeah.
ask the gravity of the situation. I think is a really good phrase, right? So I'm going to ask your viewers, right? How do they know when a situation is intense? How do they know when a situation is dire? How do they know when the situation is very fun loving? Right? I mean, yes, you have your conscious mind, your perception, and you're reading these cues, and we are socially conditioned to understand certain cues in certain kinds of ways, 100%, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but I would say there's also a certain kind of feeling all the time that's happening, right? And I know sometimes people feel the word feeling is wishy-washy, but it's like, well, is that really true though? So, for instance, going back to sports, if there was no feeling to a sporting event, why would I be a fan? Why would I spend hundreds of dollars to go see a football game or a baseball game where there's no feeling whatsoever? That's especially true in terms of music. Why would I go to a live concert if there's no feeling to the experience? Right? Why would I be in love with someone if there's no feeling between us? Right? So again, that feeling can mean different things. We have emotion, right? All kinds of stuff. But I think one sliver of that feeling experience is this thing we call the vibe.
I have a slew of little questions I want to ask you, but I do want to cover some further content of what you wrote. And you had talked about magnitude, intensity, and what was the last one? Temperament?
Yes, yeah.
Temperament. Okay. Do you want to open those up? And then, like I said, I have half a dozen little questions, like back and forth kind of questions related to the work.
So as we try to develop our conscious awareness and a conscious articulation of the vibe, it's important to develop certain kinds of concepts that help us understand the nature of the vibe, right? So certain vibes um, are very intense, very sharp. They stand out, right? Other times it's more of a dull experience where there's a lot of it. Like there's kind of like an engulfing kind of experience, right? So in terms
Hmm.
of intensity or magnitude, but then also temperament in terms of each person is in some way partially defined by the vibe that they give off, right? So each person has a core identity, core personality, also a core vibe or core bodily emanation, right? And we distinguish each other between how each person makes us feel, right? So this person feels this way, this person over here feels a different kind of way. Again, this band or this athlete or this politician, right? Each one has their own kind of temperament. And
Hmm.
so temperament is a way to describe kind of the uh, different personality types or differentiating experiences of this vibe compared to that vibe.
Okay. Yeah, I might go into my tangent of little questions
Sure,
for you.
totally.
So the one that keeps nagging at me, vibing in my head, is we are creatures of mimesis, and so we are mimicry, we are mimetic, sort of the meme. And I wonder what role this plays as, again, this subtle underlying driver of our uh, affect, mood, behavior, even our like the ocean scale, like like how we are defined as characters, personas, and things like that. Would you speculate on like what role this thesis of yours plays in those kind of social interactions? And you've covered a lot of this, but I just want to try to see if I can push it out again into that range of how we behave as social creatures, how we have this kind of really compared to, and I'm not trying to be anthropocentric here, but just I think we're above, where this level of communication and self-reflection and all these different things, how much that really weaves into our relations. And
Um, so again, I'll invite your viewers and listeners to imagine themselves walking into a large, crowded room, maybe like a conference center or something like that, but like it's a very large room, all kinds of people around there, and you don't know anyone, right? And now ask yourself, well, how do you navigate this particular situation, this environment? Right? So you have your perceptual cues, right? You're reading everyone, seeing how they're interacting with each other, seeing if they're making eye contact with you, right, etc. Right? Um, but at the same time, though, I'll go back to this notion of feeling, energy, and vibe, etc. Right? And so, who are you being attracted to or being repelled from? Right? Who are you getting a warm feeling from or a standoffish feeling? Right? Who is someone that when you see them like, oh, I'd like to talk to that person, or conversely, I do not want to talk to that person.
mm,
Right? And so all this is happening usually, um, before our conscious threshold, but yet we're still making these judgments, kind of a pre-rational judgment in terms of how do I navigate this room with a bunch of strangers. Right? And I think the vibe plays, again, not the only role, but a key role in this pre-reflective interaction.
mm. I think you mentioned in the article that I read that charismatic leaders, people who are influential. Do you think there are people who are dialed into this consciously? And so, in other words, if they are being persuasive or manipulative or whatever, that they understand this kind of this subtle behavioral, phenomenological relationship with others? Do you think there are
Sure.
people who are,
Mhm.
capable of hacking this, if you will? I don't know if that's the right way to say it.
I would say yes. It would be on a case by case basis. I don't want
Okay.
to say that everyone who is charismatic is consciously tapped into the vibe. I don't want to say that because I just don't know, right?
Okay.
Um, but I think though that any charismatic uh, speaker or leader of some sort is in some way aware of this phenomenon. Whether they call it the vibe or not is debatable. You have to ask them each person. I don't know, right? But I personally can't imagine standing in front of hundreds or thousands of people and being able to command their attention, their respect, right? They're listening to every word that you're saying and not being aware that some kind of nonverbal exchange is happening here.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the words themselves. That's not what makes a great speech. It makes a great speech content, but a great speaker transcends the content itself, right? They exude a certain kind of magnetism that other people don't have. I'm not saying we're not capable of it, but this one particular individual, though, is able to do it on a regular basis, right? And so, again, now, if we go further with that and say, can it be manipulated? The answer is yes. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but in other words, you can learn to develop this skill set, right, and learn how to project a certain kind of vibe in a certain kind of way at the right time to have a certain kind of influence and effect on other people. There's no doubt about that.
Do you think practitioners of psychology, again, whether it's explicit or implicitly engaging with the pickup of these vibes and the subtle cues when they're working with someone in a therapeutic session, that could be an asset, right? A utility that they can
Oh,
capitalize
100%.
on.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it, right?
Yeah.
So, again, whether they use the word vibe or not, I am not sure, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to think about someone who's a good therapist, you're a good listener, and you are present to the other person, right? And I think that's important understanding there, right? You have more ability to be aware of the exchange of energy when you are present in the world. If there's too much psychological clutter going on inside your own head, then you're missing out on all this pre-reflective, pre-conscious interaction, right? And one of the jobs of a therapist is kind of to be an open container for the client, right? And that relationship, though, is a unique exchange, and that it evokes from the client a willingness to self-diverge and self-disclose, right? It's almost as if the therapist is emanating a certain vibe that
Mm-hmm.
invites the other person to participate in this self-disclosure.
Mm-hmm. Um, Almost like a very subtle, I don't want to say transference. I'm trying to think of like transference when you sort of take on roles as therapist and patient, and there may be a mother archetype that comes out, and that and this may sound scrambled, but it's just like that subtlety, that unspoken connection that's going on there could evoke that kind of feeling like, oh my gosh, this is a parental sibling, filial moment, and I want, yeah. So anyway, I'm just curious, like that,
Well, let's
how that
pause there
shows
for a
up.
moment. We should pause. I think that's important, right? So again,
Yeah.
using therapist as an example here. Now, I'm not a therapist, although I've been to therapists plenty of times. I think we all should go to therapists.
Yeah.
I support that 100%, right? Right.
I
Um,
haven't gone, but I really need to go. just for clarity's sake.
right, right. Um, I think a good therapist has the ability to modulate their bodily emanation and to adapt their bodily emanation to whatever the needs are of the client.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Almost like a maestro, like a musical maestro, where you kind of
Mm.
like you're in the background, but you're conducting the orchestra, right? And you're giving the orchestra what they need, or in this case, you are giving the client what they need, right? And so it's almost, and at the same time as the therapist and the client enter into this relationship with each other, right? They form a certain kind of vibrational bond, right? And then the therapist is able to kind of, I'll say, navigate, bring up or bring down or move the client in certain kinds of ways that is therefore therapeutic.
Helps with revelation or
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, catharsis and bringing
yes,
things out and so
yes,
forth.
great
Yeah.
word, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then on the day to day out on the street, I'm thinking along these lines. It's a bit redundant, but the idea of if you're self-aware enough, and your narcissism is, and we're all narcissistic, but or ego-driven or whatever you want to call that, that if there is a self-awareness attunement there, that you can pick up on those subtle cues, that short of manipulating people, it's a way of having that extra layer of connection and communication with people, and that could be for good or bad, I guess.
Sure.
You have to be neutral about that. But it seems like if you're self-aware and you're not just oblivious and everything's an object for you to manipulate, that you can tune into this really easily, more explicitly than implicitly, I guess.
Yes, correct. Yeah, right.
Okay.
That's a big part of what I'm trying to do with my work is, again, helping other people understand the nature of the vibe, how to explain it, how to define it, how to recognize it, and then, of course, how to actually experience it and feel it, right? And so what happens as you start to go down this road, as you were just saying, you start to feel the world more deeply, right?
Hmm.
Um, you're kind of to use the word from earlier, you become more sentient.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Feeling plays a more prominent role in your decision making, in your judgment, right? Like you were saying earlier, in your everyday life, right? It's not just in the most dramatic, intense experiences of concerts and sports, but rather in everyday living, just in my house, going and driving from here to the store, going to the store, whatever, running my errands, all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, to break away from the human to human vibe, and I'll take two steps here, and we'll go to the and you brought this up in the article that I read, but for the sake of brevity, you didn't want to make it another 20 pages to probably cover this. But when we relate with other organisms, let's say, in sort of the bio brackets, like the first thought that comes to mind is lends to our evolutionary capacity to survive, is that you feel the vibe of that possibly predatory or aggressive animal. Like I can bring up the image of a dog whose hair is standing up on his back and he's growling. I mean, there are obviously physical cues there, but I would think that that's a supercharged example of a vibe that's coming off of another living creature. Again, I'll pick a predator to be dramatic, but I think they almost exhibit a. So in other words, we get rid of all the Freudian Jungian baggage of metaconsciousness. You just have this raw instinctual animal that's exhibiting these behaviors, and it may not even be exhibiting the physical cues, but just the morphology of a dog or a big cat or something like that would get us to attune quickly and read the vibe of that animal. Is it in a kind of chill mode? Is it not, thinking of me as a meal or something that needs to be killed to protect its young? So I think we could extend this out into into the other living systems that are on the planet, right?
Yeah, so I'll say a few things here. This could be a whole episode
Yeah,
onto itself.
I know, and that's why I qualified in the beginning. I was
Right.
like, you touched on this, but I just want to open it up just a
Yeah,
little bit.
totally. Yeah. I think it's super important. So I'll say this. I'll preface it by saying this. When I was younger, I thought the vibe was only a human to human phenomenon,
Okay.
and I did that partially only because trying to articulate this is already difficult enough. Once you start extending beyond human interaction, it becomes very complicated very quickly, right? But as I've grown, matured, had more experiences, and had more time to think about all this, I do think that other species emanate a certain kind of energy.
Mm.
And I'll circle back to that in 1 second. So, for instance, focusing just on humans for right now, how is it that we know who the unspoken leader is in a certain group of people? Right? They carry themselves in a certain kind of way without saying anything. Now, part of that is literally nonverbal cues, like literally, right? The way they carry themselves physically. But with that comes a certain kind of vibe, energy, mood, atmosphere, whatever it is, right? And we kind of like, that's the leader. That's the person right there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, in the animal kingdom, the same thing happens. Right? Like you can tell which cat or which dog is the leader within a group of cats and dogs, right? Just by observing what's happening. And then you can actually see the other animals responding to them in a certain kind of way, a certain level of deference. Right? And again, there's all kinds of registers of experience that lead to this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But I think this exchange of energy is part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, so I don't have any pets now, but I grew up with pets, mostly cats, but also a dog.
Mm-hmm.
And as a pet person, you feel connected to your pet. I mean, there's no doubt about that. There's no doubt. Yes,
And a cat, perfect timing. I got a cat sleeping on my lap here. My co-producer.
Right.
Sorry.
And so from there, right, I think that again, there's a certain kind of subtle vibrational affectivity happening between you and your pet. And also at times, there's a certain kind of conscious exchange of energy between you and your pet. Okay? And then from there, though, like from pets and animals, what about going into nature, into the forest? So I've had the privilege to go out to the West Coast a few times and see the redwood forest out there.
Mm.
Right? So if your listeners don't know, redwood forest, these are trees that are 1,000 or 3,000 years old. And when you're out there, man, it's a different kind of experience. I mean, it's just, you're in the presence of something very different than the trees in my yard. Right. And again, now from there, I want to be intellectually honest here. It's like, well, how do we parse this all out?
Mm-hmm.
There are multiple modes of experience happening here between me and the tree. But there could also be something else happening here that's called the vibe or exchange of energy. right? And you can feel that, right? There is a certain level of feeling happening here that is part of the human experience and the human condition.
Yeah, I wasn't going to open it up, but you're bringing botany into it, and I have a huge passion for horticulture and
Oh,
botany.
you'd
So
mentioned that, right? Yeah.
yeah. So I this could be branching more into figurative interpretation of your work and your thesis, but yeah, I think even color cues and things that we, again, going back to our evolutionary history, that the plant flora fauna relationship, that what plants do to exhibit cues and characteristics of their shapes and colors and things like that. It may not necessarily be a vibe, but I would almost want to leave a little room for that, other than the obvious uh, light, color, physical cues, that I wonder if there could be something going on, because I grant plants that, I don't grant them the agential nature that we have. They're different things, they're different systems, but I wonder what the relationality would be there. And I'll just leave it at that. I have to be totally agnostic to it. But again, as a plantophile or whatever that is, florophile, I just can't
Right.
help but think that. So in other words, we could abstractly argue that plants have conditioned us, by way of the treats they offer, the tubers and the fruits and the pulp and all these different things that are being offered, as gifts to the animals that come by, that we enter into relationship with them. I don't know if there's your thesis of vibes involved in that, but I can't help but think that there's subtle
Sure. Yeah.
things going on there. Maybe I don't know, but I just had to bring my plants into the whole thing. And it also brings me to what might be a very asymmetrical relationship with res extensia, the world itself, the planet, rocks and things. And I'm not ascribing animism to it, but that, as you touched on there, everything has a vibrational pattern and frequency. I mean, if we try to get reductionist, we go down to probabilities. And so we can perhaps, again, leave the door open for the idea that our bodily systems of sense organs and sense data acquisition, that there is a relationship between this living system, again, this living Markov blanket, and because that Markov blanket exchanges information with the environment, and we could, again, maybe use our imagination and say that there is this vibrational relationship at some level of that, because again, we can be reductionists and go all the way down to probability. So
Sure.
that goes back to what you were saying about the New Agers talking about, quantum
Right.
this and quantum that, which is, for me, is usually bullshit. But there is always a kernel of truth in something that
Right.
people consistently want to appeal to. So anyway, that I wanted to also throw that in.
Oh,
So we
yeah.
go from humans to flora and
Right.
fauna down to what might. And again, I'm not invoking, not even panpsychism or
Right.
animism or yada yada yada, organism or any of that stuff.
But now
So
to pause there for a moment, though. So how do I put this? So one of the ways that I envision the vibe and bodily emanation is that everything in my environment is affecting me in a certain kind of way, right?
mm-hmm.
Taking in perceptual cues, my subconscious mind, all that kind of stuff. And all of those environmental cues, though, affect the vibe that I give off, whether I'm aware of it or not, right? So now, if we talk about being in the garden or in the forest, maybe trees don't give off a vibe. Maybe plants don't give off a vibe. Let's just say for right now, we don't know,
Mm-hmm.
right? But being in that environment as opposed to my office that I'm in right now, or being in New York City, right? These are all different environments that will evoke a different kind of vibe from me, right? Based on literally the physical environment that I'm in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so when I think about gardening, so as I've gotten older, I like to garden as well. I love the early spring or late mid spring where you're out there planting. Bees are all over the place, and there's a certain kind of feeling slash vibe that I get in April and May that
Mm-hmm.
is different than, let's say, July and August, which is different than January and February. Right? Each season evokes and provokes its own certain kind of vibe from me.
Mm-hmm.
But now again, there's all kinds of things there. Some people like spring, some people hate spring, some people like winter, hate winter, etc. But the
Yeah.
environment will evoke something from you in a certain kind of way, regardless of your own idiosyncratic response to it.
Mm-hmm. 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 and along these lines, in having read your article, it got me thinking about intentionality and about the aboutness of the other that the subject is in relation with. And again, I would say that physics is demonstrating to us that this relationship, the aboutness of the qualities of the other, that we're, like you said, the bees buzzing around and things like that. If you want to call it a vibrational relationship or a vibe relationship, again, we have to seesaw between or oscillate between metaphysical assumption or making claims and what
Right.
might be more epistemic, just how do we know the reality that we're working with here, and the activity of the bee and the flower in spring being cued to say it's time for the bee to work on, I mean, I'm getting very what is that, the Buddhist thing, the interconnectedness,
Yes.
there's
Yeah.
just this relationality is nearly infinite,
Right.
to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
bounds
100%.
of
Yeah.
our physical systems that
Yeah.
is the universe. So,
Right.
so, and I love the paradox to me that to get deep for a second, that systemicity, the unified unitary singularity of whatever we want to call the physical world, is undifferentiated, yet at the same time seemingly paradoxically cellular, and that everything has to relate, which is why I was saying scale and variance earlier, from these physical cells communicating to you and I as cells communicating. It may be much more subtle, and there's not little zaps going between us per se, but that
Right.
we have to sort of see the continuum or the continuity of those relations. So anyway,
Yeah. No, I agree 100%. Yeah. And going back to one of the words you just mentioned a moment ago from phenomenology, intentionality. So within
yeah,
phenomenology, all consciousness is consciousness of something, right? And it's referred to as intentionality, right?
yeah,
Um, but now we can break that open. It's like, well, I can attend to different things,
mm-hmm,
right? And so one of the things I'm trying to get us to do is to attend to this thing we call the vibe, right? That
mm-hmm,
rather than just a catchphrase for anything and everything, right? So, well, let's pause here for a moment. And is this thing an actual real experience? And if so, how might we consciously attend to it to make it more of a conscious experience? Right. So
mm-hmm,
that's the word intentionality here is important.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
for opening that up. We talked about running about an hour, and so I want to give us a 10 to 15-minute window. My idea of spiritual is kind of what we're doing right now, where there are these two psyches, these two
Yeah.
minds that are relating and opening up information and putting it out into the commons of the human experience. You have talked about music and concerts and things like that, and I can relate, having gone to, and we talked about this in our pre-meet. We both went to raves back in the 90s,
Right.
and you get into this thing, and but what I find in that is that the music is a means for transcendence, and by transcendence I mean ritual and disruption again on an oscillatory thing, and it could be one or the other, but I like to think of one and the other. So you're disrupting your normal 9 to 5 every day, yada yada. You go to what, my cat just got off my lap and pulled the microphone plug out. Thanks. There's something in that, but anyway, but yeah, so ritual leads to transcendence, and the music is that carrier wave of bringing us into this kind of synchronicity, or this synchronous flow state, or however you want to call that. And to me, that's so I want to put icing on the cake of what we've been talking about here, and hand it over to you and say, man, what a great environment when we are in not just music, but we could all go to a kind of maybe a meditation retreat where we focus on one thing together as a collective, but as also singular entities. So I'll hand that back off to you, and let's talk about how music and the vibes that come from the amplifiers, or the instruments themselves, or the voice, can help facilitate a
Sure.
collective experience of the vibe.
Yeah. Um, well, music, as is all sound, it's actually a physical vibration. That's how sound works, right?
Yeah.
So two objects or forces come into contact with each other. They actually vibrate the air that when they come in contact, those air vibrations then enter our eardrums, and we process that into sound, right? So all sound is a physical vibration. And so now we're at a concert or a rave or a club, whatever the case, a party, whatever it is, right? You have the physical vibration of the music, and it usually tends to be very loud, right? And so now your body starts to get actually rhythm with that music, right? And of course, though, other people are around you, and so now you have numerous other people, human beings, right? We're now forming a certain kind of collective where it's our intention is towards the music is moving our bodies in a certain kind of way, and then we're aware that we're collectively having this experience together, right? And that collective experience tends to get us out of our own heads, right? We become less egotistical, right? And then more egoless, which then that allows, like we were saying earlier, the disruption to happen, right? So as we let down our small little peephole of an ego, right, other kinds of thoughts, other kinds of emotions, other kinds of experiences now are able to come to the surface, and we have different ideas, different visions. I don't mean that spiritually, but different visions, right? And then collectively, as we experience that, though, we're in some way like meta aware of that we're all doing this together, which is why a great concert is such an enthralling experience, right? It's like you walk out of there almost out of breath because you felt different, you were thinking differently, right? And it's a physical experience that you have. It's not just mental, but you physically feel that. And a really good concert can last hours or days or even weeks after the experience. Like you're still riding the high of that concert for days later, right? And I think a large part of that, though, has to do with this thing called the vibe. You have the physical vibrations, right, that then provoke a certain kind of bodily emanation from us as a collective. And then we're aware of that collective vibe that's happening all at once. And that's when you turn to your friend, like, man, the energy in space is crazy. Do you feel that? And that's what it's about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can remember an instance a long time ago, and I went down to it was kind of a slapdash rave. It was at a theater, and they just had us up on the stage, and there's 500 seats around it, so it wasn't really a good place to get together. But we went, and there was probably 70 or 80 people, and I can remember, and this was being facilitated by psilocybin mushrooms as well, because I live in Florida, so we ate a few shrooms before we went in. But I can remember just being in my own space, and my friend Suzanne was on the other side of the stage, and we were both starting to like break into this big like shit-eating grin, and like all of a sudden we were just kind of, and I looked over at her, and she was kind of having the same
Right.
sort of, and we talked about it later, and I'm like, I looked over at you at one point, and I said, we just eyes contact, boom, and I said, what were you feeling at that moment? And we described the affect. And so anyway, as an anecdote for, to sort of solidify that, but and again, it was that droning beat. It's the synchrony or whatever that the music,
Synchronicity. Mm-hmm.
yeah, the synchronicity of the music, plus again a little bit of serotonin agonist going on there to help, like you said, drop the ego down a little bit, get you a little more open to experience or to perception. But I'll never forget that moment. We both looked at each other from 35 feet away, and I just kind of grinned at her, not just because of the mushroom. I was just like,
Right. Yeah.
"Oh, you're there. I know where you are." Yeah,
No, that's a great experience. I'm
yeah.
glad you shared that. And that can happen. I've had that experience happen with total strangers.
Okay.
You're at a rave, a party, a club, a concert, whatever it is. Everyone's in the groove. Everyone's jamming out together, and you make eye contact with someone, and it goes back to the idea of attraction, right? Like you're both in the same groove at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
You're having kind of a certain kind of unspoken dialogue with each other,
Right.
right? And you can feel that bond you have with that person. And so in your case, it was with your friend, but the same thing can happen with a total stranger and it can last anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 hours at the concerts, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's another example of how this vibe thing happens at a pre-conscious and pre-reflective level, right? That allows us to connect with each other, to groove with each other, to jam with each other, right? And to help each other. In many ways, tying this back to earlier, it almost becomes a therapeutic experience, right? Where we both become the therapist and the client in this situation, and we're helping each other kind of navigate the world together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This gets me to thinking, and I kind of thought of it earlier when I was reading what you wrote in your thesis, but I'll bring it up. The flow state,
Mhm.
whether it's a single person flowing with something they're good at, or people getting together and then they get. There's a guy on YouTube called John Vervaeke, and he calls it dialectic into dialogos, like you're opening up the logos,
Awesome.
and that's a flow state of the intellect. Kind of like what we're doing. We're unpacking an idea and we're rolling with it. So I think the vibe facilitates that, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's a
100%, yeah.
means to that opening. If again, if we drop out of our uh, uh, apprehensive nature of being guarded, and then we just get a little bit vulnerable and curious, and we are in a space of consensual, we all know that we're in good faith trying to do something. So what does a flow state mean to you in relation
Yeah,
to?
so I mean, flow state. So it usually comes from the field of positive psychology, and when we enter a flow state, it's where our subjectivity and the activity that we are performing become one.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in this flow state, right? And it comes with a certain kind of experience where time seems to stop, right? The nature of space becomes altered, and you're kind of in this paradox where the experience feels like it's well choreographed, but at the same time though it's improvisational, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the balance right there. Right
Okay.
now, one thing that a lot of people don't talk about is coupling the flow state with the vibe. So I like to think of it as like your personal vibe flow. Like how do you enter? Like what allows you to enter a flow state, and what kind of vibe is then evoked from that flow state? Now, when you're in that flow state, you experience from the inside, right? And your perception of the world is altered in certain kinds of ways. But we can often see other people when they're in their flow states. So think of again a band that is playing the song perfectly. They're in that flow state. Think of dancers on stage, and it's a well choreographed dance routine, and they nail it. Or an actor or actors on stage, or even a sports team when they're in the zone, so to speak, right? You can tell when other human beings enter that flow state. And with that flow state, though, you can feel it happening, right?
Mm.
They evoke a certain kind of vibe, and then you can feel that exchange of energy between you and the people you're watching.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Because and it's one of those things. It's like, well, I don't know how to define it, but I know when I'm there. I mean,
Exactly.
you
Yep.
defined it very well, but I mean that's such a like everyday street experience, and
Right.
you're not setting yourself up for it, but when you drop in and you're just like,
Right.
like you said, everything gets a little different, but it's just the affect that comes from that is
Mhm.
like, oh my God, yeah. I don't get it very often, but when I do,
But when
I'm
you
like,
do, you know, and you want
ooh,
more of
yeah.
it, right? Yeah. Totally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's magical. And it's almost like meditating because there's times when I don't meditate much anymore. I want to get back in, but I used to meditate a lot. And I would drop into this space where a lot of stuff would drop away. And I was just at this sort of low level of awareness. And if I thought about that low level of awareness, I'd come back to
Yeah.
another low, but I'd get down to this thing where it was so satisfying and such a relief to not be that self anymore, that you can be in this kind of quietude. Um, which to me, if we were to put the vibe on a Hertz scale like you do with brainwave states, and that's what's going on essentially. I guess you're down in delta or whatever. But yeah, that vibe I think slows down enough.
Sure.
It's like it syncs up with this maybe the psychological
Right.
or neuropsychological
Yep.
processes. So much coolness in all this, Jason. I really appreciate having met you and having
Sure.
read what you've got to offer to the YouTube audience. I'm definitely going to have everything down below in the description field to access Jason's work and the 20-minute sessions. Is it a session or is it's a composite of things that I think you
Yeah, it's called
described it?
the 20-minute vibe. It's a website I have and has essays, videos, self-paced lectures and whatnot. And so again, it's an educational space to help people understand the vibe.
Okay. Okay. And again, that will be accessible in the description. Now, I'm not trying to shoo us off too fast because what I want to do now is open up space for anything that we didn't cover or questions I didn't ask you. If there's something you want to broadcast out and share, let's
Um,
do that right now. And
sure.
because I know you said you had kind of like an hour, so
Yeah, yeah. So in terms of helping people to understand this thing that we call the vibe and having it be more than just a catch-all phrase for everything, right? I would invite your viewers to learn how to differentiate between emotions, intuition, and vibes, and then differentiate between your own vibe and the vibe of other people. Right? So when we talk about emotions, one basic definition might be something like um, your response to a perceived set of circumstances. Right? Something's happening, you have an emotional response. Whether it's really happening or not doesn't make a difference. It's your emotional response. Right? Then the word intuition, again, that's often used within New Age and stuff like that. But I think intuition, though, is something very basic, right? Your body's inserted into the environment, and your body is aware of the environment in a way that precedes and exceeds your conscious mind, right? And if you allow your conscious mind to be in tune with your body, your subconscious mind, that's intuition. Right? Now, a lot of times, intuition is conflated with the vibe. They're similar, but not exactly the same. Right? So you
okay.
have emotions, you have intuition, and then you have the vibe in terms of bodily emanation. Right? And that's where the term bodily emanation I think is helpful because it helps you to envision that it is literally something different than intuition.
Mm.
Then differentiating between your own vibe and the vibe of others can be challenging, but it's helpful. And so next time you're in a situation with other people and you're feeling something in the room or in the crowd, ask yourself, like, well, is this the vibe that I'm giving off? Or is it the vibe that I'm experiencing and feeling from other people? Right. And that will increase your, let's say, your vocabulary for the vibe, for energy, for bodily emanation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I'm being redundant here, but I do want to insert something that I think is really important in the thesis that you wrote, that we typically center awareness up here in this shell, but there was mention in the thesis that it's holistic, and
Right.
and I challenge you, so that the audience, I challenge you to find the locus of awareness, right? It just happens that a lot of our sense organs are in our head, and it seems intuitive, but I wanted to include that too, that this is a somatic, deeply strong, and of course, a lot of processing occurs up here. So I'm not trying to deflate the value of the brain, but I just wanted to emphasize that this is
Right.
a deeply somatic and a
Right.
holistic experience.
And that obviously the brain is part of the body, that the
Yeah,
brain
yeah.
is the body, like it's part of the heart, lungs, all the other organs, etc.
Mm-hmm,
But the brain plays a certain role in processing information, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
At the same time, though, awareness is not reducible to the brain or to quote the mind, right?
Yeah,
Awareness is an embodied phenomenon. And then the vibe and bodily emanation is part of that awareness and part of our consciousness.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I just, again, it probably got, I have short-term memory issues. I can remember really heavy stuff, but I can't remember what I did 10 minutes ago. So I just want to make sure that that was covered. And then let's maybe end on a note forward looking. What do you think the future of the philosophy of the vibe might entail? And do you think young academics might, inherit that seed which you planted, and what do you see perhaps, or what would you like to see perhaps moving this forward?
I would like to see, in terms of, let's say, academia, to have some cross-discipline discussion investigation,
Hmm.
right? So I'm obviously very influenced by philosophy, but philosophy, cognitive science, psychology, anthropology, sociology, right? Trying to invite other scholars from different disciplines to take up this notion of the vibe in a serious way and
Hmm.
have some cross-disciplinary conversation about this.
And I am merely a layperson, general audience guy, but I'm seeing what you just said, that this can be explored and the inquiry can be launched, or series of inquiries can be launched in a Bayesian kind of sense, just carry that forward, because I think it deserves, I think it, without declaring it as a strong sense like smell or anything else, it is a sense and it's not even a sense, it's the emanation, but it can be categorized perhaps partially as a sense that should be, we should make aware of, especially when we're entering into this age of um, of um, Moeller calls it prophilicity, where our identity, there is a so-called authentic self, which is tentative, but there's also the prophilicity that we, especially younger folks, are generating this other identity exists online or exists as a profile or an avatar, and that the vibe may not necessarily be able to be abstracted into that. So again, in anchoring ourselves in authenticity, that the vibe can be a tool for that innate sense, that intuitive sense of what's going on around you, the sense making mode that is
Sure.
the emanating vibe. That doesn't, perhaps I could be proven wrong, and that would be interesting, but I don't know if that carries out into prophilicity, which again I think is endemic or something going on with the saturation of technology and things like that. And so I think this is a good anchoring device for our staying embodied in the sense, and again, personality and identity are tentative and contingent, right? There's so many
Right.
things that could alter that, but we have to start somewhere. And so anyway, I'm babbling, but
Yeah, yeah.
I think what you're doing is, again, a good faith gesture to help humanity with self-awareness and navigation, of experience and so forth. So I applaud you for that, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah, and I look forward to what's next, and you will certainly continue to to carry to this banner, and like I said, I would love to see young, as you just said, cross-disciplinary inquiry and young academics picking this up and weaving it into the tapestry of whatever they're doing. So here's to that. Let's hope that's any last thoughts, ideas, or anything you want to share before we because I know, like I said,
No,
I don't
I'll
want to.
repeat what I said earlier. I invite your viewers and listeners to think about the vibe and pay attention to how often they use the word
Mm-hmm,
or they hear the word being used, and then ask yourself, like, what does the person mean by this, right?
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
there's something more to the word than just the word. Is it an experience? Is it a feeling? Is it an exchange of energy, etc.? Other than that, I just want to say thank you, Justin, for having me on. This was a wonderful conversation. I had a lot of fun, and thank you to the viewers and listeners. Hope they got something out of it.
I'm sure they did because, like I said, my subscribership, this I think falls well within the wheelhouse of. Oops, I'm disappearing again. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good. Yeah.
Okay, I think it must be loose. But yeah, I think my audience that subscribes to this show will absolutely appreciate this conversation. So, Jason, thank you so much, and to the audience as well. Thank you for your time. I'll say goodbye to you after we stop record, but thank you for this conversation, and I consider myself a student of the work that you're doing, and I'll continue to look forward to any progress that might go on with the work. So, like I said, we'll chat after I stop record. But thank you again, YouTube audience. You guys take care. I hope it was a good conversation for you as well.